Something happened last night that caused me to come to a sobering realization. I may have reached the act of the play called life where I have officially become old and out of touch. But I guess when you style yourself with a name like Captain Curmudgeon, perhaps it's better that this realization arrives sooner rather than later. I spent my Sunday evening watching The Suicide Squad, not to be confused with Suicide Squad without the, which is the 2016 DC film that was edited with a blender and had the visual aesthetic of a kid vomiting Skittles all over a laptop screen, to which this new film acts as a quasi-sequel or soft reboot or non-reimagined reimagining, or one of those stupid terms that Hollywood types use when they're trying to convince the studio execs to scratch a $200 million check so they can make a slightly different version of a movie that sucked 5 years ago, and in the hopes that said studio execs won't notice that nobody in this industry has had an original idea in over 35 years. As for my actual review of the film, that won't take much time at all. This might be the honest-to-God worst movie I have ever seen in my life. And I have seen Catwoman and Iron Eagle 3, so that's something I don't say lightly at all. I didn't know anything about it going in, except that it was a sort of not really follow-up to the thoroughly god-awful Suicide Squad movie from 2016. I hadn't read any reviews or watched any YouTube videos on it, so my only reference point going in was the fact that it's got a 92% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. That didn't lead me to believe it was going to be a good movie. Rather, I took it as just a culmination of the phenomenon we first witnessed starting with The Last Jedi, where the shill-tastic fake entertainment press spend a week or two bloviating rhapsodically about what a wonderfully fine piece of filmmaking this is, then the fans go to see it and they say, wow, that movie's a real piece of shit. And so in the intervening 5 or 6 years, we've seen increasingly wide disparities between critical reception and audience reception. In fact, I think every prominent movie critic is still on record as saying Ghostbusters 2016 was a funny, entertaining film. But we all know what that phenomenon is emblematic of. Hollywood no longer makes movies for audiences. They make movies exclusively for movie critics. And if movie critics see a movie that comports to a satisfactory degree with their own woke leftist identitarian political worldview, then they give it a rapturous 5-star review, irrespective of how much ass it actually sucks. So nowadays, when I see a Rotten Tomatoes 92% fresh rating from the critics, I sort of instinctively assume it's a thoroughly crappy film that has a sufficiently heaping helping of wokesterism on it to reinforce the feelings of smug self-righteousness and unwarranted self-importance that the shill-tastic movie critics so love to feel. And if anything, I think the disastrous nature of the past 18 months for the film industry has only accelerated and reinforced the phenomenon, because basically anything that comes out on the big screen now is given the 5-star bestest thing ever treatment by the reviewers, because if the film industry doesn't recover to its pre-pandemic station, if billion-dollar box office hauls, or even $500 million, are going to be a thing of the past, then motion pictures will never be as culturally relevant as they were up until the spring of 2020, which means, by extension, that movie reviewers will also be less relevant. There will be fewer jobs in their field, and the ones there are won't pay as much. So the critics are absolutely desperate that some movie, any movie, will be a box office hit, that they're perfectly willing to sell whatever small scraps remain of their professional integrity in order to make that eventuality more likely. I guess the one nice thing I can say about The Suicide Squad is that it is not teeming with nauseating woke bullshit. Well, except for the now standard trope of 105-pound women who can easily dispatch dozens of armed men without breaking either a sweat or a fingernail. But for as god-awful as Suicide Squad 2016 was, and make no mistake, it was dismally bad, even though it somehow managed to pull $750 million at the box office. This new movie makes that movie look like Citizen Kane had a bastard love child with The Godfather and they named it Casablanca. I don't think I have ever struggled harder to make it through an entire motion picture. I had to take a break halfway through to get some chores done and get some liquor in me, which I hoped would help make the second half more tolerable, but it didn't. I know probably a lot more adjectives than most people do, but I am at a loss to think of one that does justice to this film's abject, nuclear-level sucktasticness. But there's a side benefit to making it all the way through an awful movie, because I'm thinking it'll be worth it afterward. I can go on YouTube and watch the scathing hate reviews, and I'll appreciate them more having forced myself to sit through the entire movie. At least, that was how my thinking went initially. Now, there aren't a whole lot of pop culture type channels that I frequent, but the ones I do, they're run by people who, generally speaking, have opinions of movies and shows that aren't too far removed from my own, or barring that, if they liked something I didn't, or vice versa, I can at least identify with their rationale for why they think that way. So I get done with the flick, mercifully, and I go straight to YouTube thinking I've got a couple hours of deliciously negative reviews to watch. Except that didn't happen. Somehow, everybody seemed to love it? And I'm not going to name any names here. Red Letter Media, Critical Drinker, Nerdrotic, Heel vs. Babyface, Mr. Sunday Movies. But I simply cannot fathom that these guys watched the same movie I did and came away thinking it was anything but a steaming pile of unmitigated cringe, which leaves me no choice but to surmise that I have crossed over into cranky old man territory, because I don't see anything on offer from the Suicide Squad except dick jokes and over-the-top gratuitously graphic violence. And don't get me wrong, I love a good dick joke as much as the next son of a bitch, but there are no good dick jokes here, unless saying the word dick a whole bunch of times counts as a joke. Similarly, when it's done right, over-the-top gratuitous graphic violence can be fun if it's done with a bit of restraint and in the context of a good script. Deadpool, Kingsman, just to name a couple examples that come to mind. But I am supposed to be amused over the 30th guy getting his head lopped off or the 20th guy getting his face exploded? So there is my mea culpa, ladies and gentlemen. I have become a cranky geriatric who cannot appreciate high-quality cinema. What's that, Jim Eagle? You liked it when Pete Davidson got his face blown off? Yeah, I didn't mind that part either. That wasn't too bad. And nobody asked you anyway. You just work here. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I may be a stick in the mud, but it's at least my mud. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. And I want to talk about the picture that ran on the cover of the Sporting News on the 7th of October, 1920. A grand jury had just convened to determine whether 8 members of the Chicago White Sox should be indicted for having engaged in a criminal conspiracy to throw the 1919 World Series to the Cincinnati Reds. Since it was an ongoing matter in the courts, the Sporting News wasn't able to do much in terms of editorializing at that stage, lest they taint the jury pool and if the case wound up going to trial, so they kept the words to a minimum. "Fix these faces in your memory," said the banner at the top of the page. "These are the 8 men charged with selling out baseball," said the banner on the bottom. And in between were the faces of the accused men. Chick Gandil, Happy Felsch, Joe Jackson, Eddie Cicotti, Lefty Williams, Fred McMullen, Steve Swedersberg, and Buck Weaver. The editors of the Sporting News were saying as clearly as they could, insofar as they were talking about men who, at that stage, hadn't been charged with or convicted of any wrongdoing, that if these men wind up being judged guilty, and this scandal winds up being the end of professional baseball as America's national game, then you, dear readers, you damn well need to remember their faces and their names so that no one ever forgets who authored, in exchange for a few pieces of silver, the demise of the country's foremost cultural institution. 2 weeks after the appearance of that cover, 22 October 1920, the grand jury handed down its decision, and all 8 men were duly indicted. The trial lasted until 3 August of the following year, when, due to the suspiciously convenient disappearance of much of the key evidence, including sworn confessions by Gandil, Williams, and Cicotti, all 8 defendants were acquitted by the jury after a mere 3 hours of deliberation, and you thought the O.J. Simpson jury invented that move, after which the defendants, the jurors, and the judge all adjourned to the Italian restaurant across the street and celebrated into the wee hours of the next morning The ball players all assuming that they were in the clear and were free to return to work for spring training in 1922. But hold up there, fellas. Because the newly minted commissioner of baseball, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, whom the owners had invested with absolute, unreviewable power over all aspects of the game, he was having none of it. The players were still sleeping off their celebratory hangovers when Landis issued his verdict on the matter. Quote, regardless of the verdict of juries, no player who throws a ball game, no player that undertakes or promises to throw a ball game, no player that sits in conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing a game are discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever play professional baseball. The 8 men, by now already known as the Black Sox, had their names duly placed on Major League Baseball's permanent ineligible list, where they remain to this day. You're probably wondering by now where I'm going with this, and I'll tell you. It was the Black Sox scandal, and specifically that Sporting News cover and its admonition to fix these faces in your memory, that knocked on the door of my subconscious this morning, right at the moment when I saw this photograph. So I want to deliver the same admonition to the American conservative that the Sporting News delivered to baseball fans 101 years ago. Fix these faces in your memory. Murkowski, Cassidy, Portman, Collins, Willard Romney, and the other 13 Republican swamp rat scumbags who voted to advance the Joe Biden-Nancy Pelosi $1.5 trillion fake infrastructure bill. If and when we wind up losing our society completely, losing our way of life completely, living in a version of America where the Constitution is just a quaint relic of a bygone age, fix those faces in your memory. They are the people who authored it. They are the ones who decided that having CNN like them and being invited to all the right cocktail parties was worth selling you, the American taxpayer, down the river. Fix those faces in your memory. We get nothing from the legislative branch anymore except trillion-plus dollar porkapalooza bills with names that have no relationship to their contents. The so-called infrastructure bill, as I'm sure you already know, 9% of it has anything to do with infrastructure. And none of that is for finishing the border wall, by the way. And the other 91% is a bag full of candy for the woke identitarian left. 91% of the bill is made up of things that no one who calls him or herself a conservative would ever contemplate voting for. Amnesty for illegal aliens, critical race theory in elementary schools, transgenderism for little kids, slavery reparations, every single thing the left wants to use to complete the job of rending the American nation asunder permanently and irretrievably is in that bill. And those 18 Republicans, including the 5 in the picture whose smug self-satisfaction is well evidenced by the shit-eating grins on their smarmy little faces, they all voted for it. Fix those faces in your memory. We talked in the last episode, maybe it was the episode before that, about the fallacy of fake bipartisanship, the illusion that John McCain basically devoted his entire career to upholding, the silly, nonsensical notion that if Republicans and Democrats both vote on a bill, then that makes it bipartisan, therefore it must be good for the country, right? I'm one of the only 5 Republican senators who's still allowed to be on CNN, says Willard Romney, so that means I'm bipartisan and automatically a great guy, right? As for Susan Collins, I have no idea what the people of Maine have ever seen in her, frankly. She has no commendable traits that I've ever been able to detect, but she has defined her entire career by being an obedient lapdog for the Democrats. She's one of those Republicans who steadfastly believe that if you're always a certain distance to the right of the craziest radical leftist, then that means you're a conservative in good standing. Even when you're totally oblivious to the fact that today you are a Republican senator who is to the left of where Barack Obama was in 2008. Fix those faces in your memory. There are 50 Republicans in the Senate. Fully 36% of them are on board with this $1.5 trillion radical leftist porkapalooza whose authors have dressed it up in the hollowed-out skin suit of an infrastructure bill. But hey, I guess if a 6'4" dude with an Adam's apple and a 5 o'clock shadow and a big swinging dick can transform into a woman just by putting on a dress and saying he's a chick, then a giant bag of Halloween candy for America-hating leftist identitarian maniacs can proclaim itself an infrastructure bill in exactly the same faction. Fix those faces in your memory. When our country as we know it is gone and we can never get it back, when the society in which you were born and raised becomes unrecognizable forever, when your rights and liberties are things that only exist in the past, fix those faces in your memory. Remind yourself that people like Willard Romney and Sue Collins cared more about Anderson Cooper returning their phone calls than they did about your kids and grandkids enjoying the blessings of liberty that generations of America's sons, black, white, and otherwise, fought and bled and died to preserve and protect. Fix those faces in your memory. And last thing for tonight, I don't know if you've seen the latest installment in the Rand Paul versus Tony Fauci series of steel cage grudge matches, but they had another encounter last week, and my God, I'm at a loss, frankly, to understand why the White House hasn't put a muzzle on Fauci yet, and they still let him go on TV. He's still doing his obligatory 8 to 10 media appearances each day, just as he has been for the last year and a half, and the White House has to spend unconscionable amounts of time and effort just cleaning up after whatever stupid thing he said this time. But the other day, in the Oversight Committee, under questioning from Senator Paul, Fauci once again accidentally said the quiet part out loud. As Senator Paul tried to put him on the spot, saying, "Dr. Fauci, can you give us some sort of concrete answer about where the statistics need to be where you will allow people to resume their normal lives? Can you give me a number?" And you can imagine how Fauci reacted, since this man's entire raison d'etre is to say whatever it takes so that he gets to continue being on TV every day. So of course he's not going to give a straight answer. "Well," he says, "when the rate of infection gets down to a point where..." And Senator Paul very politely says, "Can you give me a number? Please give me a number, Dr. Fauci. When are the American people allowed to have their liberty back?" And here's where Fauci screws the pooch. "Senator, I don't view this as an issue of liberty. I view it as a public health emergency." And boom, there it is, right there. That is exactly why unelected public health bureaucrats should have no plenary power whatsoever to dictate government policy, because they don't even understand how the Constitution works. It has never occurred to Tony Fauci that liberty is supposed to be the default, that he is the one who owes an explanation to us when he wants to take our liberties away, rather than the citizenry owing an explanation to him for why they should be allowed to have their liberties back. We elect presidents to make the hard calls that balance the maintenance of the people's liberty with any other exigencies that exist at the moment, including public health emergencies. But we now have a president who has totally abdicated that responsibility, which is the number one responsibility a president has, so that he can go have a goddamn ice cream cone and take a nap while Tony Fauci takes a sledgehammer to all the rights that you used to think were sacrosanct and inviolable. If you haven't seen the video clip, I do recommend you go watch it, because it's a real holy shit moment, hearing this sleazy little bastard admit out loud that he doesn't give a flying goddamn about the rights and liberties that you and I are supposed to enjoy by virtue of being U.S. citizens. He just blows it off, hand waves it away like, who does this silly senator from Kentucky think he is, coming at me with this rights and liberties stuff? Now hurry up and strap that mask on your 3-year-old, you bumpkin redneck simpleton. No, I don't owe you an explanation for anything. In case you haven't noticed, I'm the man with the white lab coat. That means my decisions are unreviewable. I am a secular demigod, the human embodiment of science itself, and you disobey me at your own peril, you goddamn silly peasants. You will accept the wisdom of my single-factor analysis. You will grin and bear all the unintended consequences of my hubris and stupidity, and you will damn well like it, or I will send my Twitter rage mob after your ass. And while you're fixing the other faces in your memory, fix his face too, because that disgusting little hobbit-looking, lying, sleazy motherfucker is going to go down as one of the most infamous figures in all of American history, and you can mark my words on that. If you're within the sound of my voice and you're represented by one of those 18 Republican senators who think turning your kids into cross-dressing race haters is a small price to pay for the fake veneer of something called bipartisanship, then you have a solemn duty as a constituent to at least, at the very minimum, call or email their office and make your displeasure known in no uncertain terms. Hell, tell them you'll be happy to vote for their Democrat opponent in the next election if it's not going to make any damn difference anyway. At least Democrats don't lie about who they are and who they represent and what they believe. Thanks for watching. See you Wednesday. Get off my lawn.